He introduced me as Richard Thieme. When I'm in Holland or Germany, it's Thieme, because that's what it used to be. But when you got off the boat in New York, you took what they gave you. So when I moved to Milwaukee, which has a strong German component, I was told that I was mispronouncing my own name and informed of how to do it correctly. So whichever you like, Thieme, Thieme. I've been part of Black Hat for some time in the United States. I think Jeffrey defined the problem that confronts the security space right now, which is how do you remain cutting edge while at the same time we are all being totally assimilated into something that 10 years ago was radical, revolutionary, and transforming, and now is becoming the basic inherent infrastructure or platform in which all people worked. When DEF CON 1 began, DEF CON being the associated conference that gave rise to or spawned Black Hat about 7 years ago, it was a few hundred people coming out of the desert, getting together in Las Vegas for the first time, and they were co-creators of a network which actually had been generated, as you know, through Milnet, ARPANET, and the military-industrial complex for several decades. But when it emerged into the public space, the people who were called then hackers began to co-create the network. But now, when I speak for hacking conventions, that is, young profiles in the United States, who are a generation later, 10 years younger, they don't remember a time when the net did not exist, just as I don't remember a time when the telephone did not exist. In accordance with that, the security space in the network is changing radically, and what is most true about it, as I float around the world observing, is that the parts that are invisible are the most potent parts. This is true not only of the chips, the wires, the code, it's also true of the higher level reaches of symbolic knowledge. Now, I understand that for some of you, for me, English is a first language. It's not always easy to know that, but it is. For many of you, English is a second or third or fourth language. If I go too fast, please stop me by raising your hand and ask me to slow down or repeat something. Do you want me to slow down at this point? Am I okay? Okay. Good. I usually test that with some kind of subtle joke to see how the English floats. 10 days ago, I was in Eilat, in Israel, and I was keynoting this is all being taped, right? I have to say it. A Microsoft security. Those two don't always matter, but in this case, they did, and the people in Israel are taking the R&D and the security quite seriously. And in Israel, with a high level of alertness and security awareness, I watched as hundreds and hundreds of technophiles came down the stairs in the hotel in Eilat to go to the opening session, and they were just jammed. And I said, it's a lot of human capital in one space. And the fellow next to me said, these are half the best brains in Israel. And I said, the left half. Okay, that was the test. All right, so that tells me if a subtlety like left brain, right brain, or some interpreted politically left and right, in either case, at least there was a double meaning, and the fact that there was a ripple or murmur of recognition tells me that we're okay. If you do need me to slow down, just tell me. What I'm going to talk about is the big picture. The big picture, as I understand it, is caused by the fact that we're not really about just securing information. If you look at the definition of security, you find what security means is making people feel safe. And feeling safe and being safe are two different things. So what this is really about is information assurance, and that's about information at the highest level. It's about symbols and the manipulation of symbols through a fractal-like chain of relationships between the human and the electronic network. And therefore the context in which it takes place is as important, if not more important, than the content, but the context is what people do not always see. So what I'm going to try to do as you start this conference, the rest of the program will be about the technical details and how to do it. This is about trying to give you an echo, your mind for the next 2 days, of those technical details and what in fact they mean. What in fact they mean to the work that you do, whether you work for government or for business, or how many here are intelligence agencies? Okay, so there's nobody here. All right, so it's just government or business then. which is the intelligence agency, the way it's built these days. So we're talking about what the meaning of the symbols really is about as it moves through the network, how it can be manipulated and managed, where it comes out, where it begins, and how it can be modularized or coupled with big picture views in order to manage perception. You understand, I am sure, that the battle space of the 21st century is the mind of society. The battle space has always been the mind of society in its collective aspect, and those who have managed it have known this. It is most apparent. Matrix 2 is opening this week. Matrix 2 is a great metaphor for a simulated world in which we have all come to live. The simulation now takes place on the single symbiotic relationship between humans and computers. You can call it the cyborg, you can call it the symbiote, you can call it the matrix, you can call it whatever you want, but we live inside a simulated world, and therefore, to know the meaning of the symbols that moves through the network is what's critical. It is not merely securing the network, it's not merely a technical challenge. It's about what happens to those symbols when they wind up where they're going. Let me give you an example. You have to use some kind of template to understand what's going on in the world, or else the network itself becomes meaningless. I have a friend who works on the edges of black operations trying to find out what's really going on. He's the kind of guy who will stand in the desert outside Area 51 in California or Nevada with a digital night vision camcorder for night after night in order to photograph something that he subsequently called the dripper, a bifurcated plasma-encased arrow that zoomed the area, which he could then take to physicists at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and say, what in hell am I looking at here? He's that kind of guy. He just has a passion for that. So one of his sources called him one day after there was a major power outage in the Pacific Northwest, near Seattle, Portland, Oregon, where Jeff is from. And he said this power outage was not an accident. I read the explanation that was provided of what took place, and it doesn't add up. It's not correct. It can't be the full explanation. Something else was going on. And this is what I think it was. It was a demonstration of power by a non-state entity, probably a terroristic or narco-terrorist network, probably out of Colombia, one of the cartels, in order to make clear to the government that they have the capacity to degrade the power structure, the power grid, or the infrastructure of the United States, not in order to destroy it, which defeats the purpose of the attack. You know the difference between organized crime and a terrorist is organized crime works with the government, and a terrorist works against the government that you think is the government, maybe with another government. So the purpose of the attack is not to kill the cow. If you kill the cow, there's no more milk. Because crime requires milk. So you keep the cow alive, feed the cow, extort it, borrow it, whatever, in order to get your share, but the farmer has to keep having the milk. So it wasn't to destroy the infrastructure and the power grid, it was to show the capacity to do so that if you don't back off, we will continue to degrade the capacity of your economy to function, which is the secondary attack, purpose of a terrorist attack. The first is to degrade the confidence of a people in its leadership. I probably shouldn't say this, but parenthetically, the confidence of the Americans in their leadership was degraded at the election. So we did not need subsequent attacks to do that for us. That's the only political comment I will make. All right, so he was concerned with the full explanation of this, and that was as far as he could get, that it was an attack by a narco-terrorist or some other non-state entity, one of those nameless, formless structures that are emerging, like in the network itself, clouds of power between the former entities for which we have names. All right, flash forward a couple of years. I'm sitting at a conference like this next to a person who is bored and disgruntled. You know, if you want information, disgruntled is great, because someone will want to talk. So he was talking about all the various things that he was privy to. He said, I assume if you're at this conference, you have a clearance. I said, because I've listened to these people long enough, that's a safe assumption. which was a good way not to answer his question. So he continued to talk about the various escapades on which he had been, and now he was leaving after 30 years of service to one of the armed forces. And this is the story he told me. He said, one of the things we did, he said, it was so funny. We were testing one of these great, big, powerful microwave pulse weapons. It was some kind of massive electronic thing. Now, I did a speech a few weeks ago at Los Alamos National Laboratory. The only place I was allowed to go alone was to the restroom. And it interested me women don't always know this, but men know that above the urinal, there's often something to read in America, lest you get bored while you're standing there. It's usually the sports page or something like that, but at Los Alamos, it was Bose-Einstein condensates, chaos and fluid in semiconductor manufacture, with stuff like that. Just the kind of thing you want to read in the 30 seconds you've got at the wall. And so at Los Alamos, they've got about 40 square miles of pretty secure territory, relatively speaking. And some of it is canyons, big canyons, where they test big weapons, quantum computing, sending electronic streams across the canyons, that sort of thing. So they were in a skiff or a secure area testing a very high-powered microwave weapon. And it was a very high-level test. He said we had to wait for a call from the Secretary of Defense to throw the switch. We had to wait till all the satellites that we were tracking were not overhead so no one could see what we were doing. And once we got the word, the SecDef called, we threw the switch. And Danby said if the power didn't go out all over the Pacific Northwest. Now, my friend had been told by his source, the only way I will know if this is a terrorist attack or demonstration of power is if it happens again. And it happened again within a week, which for him confirmed that his hypothesis was correct. But what my new friend told me was, we wanted to be sure that the cause and effect was as we thought it was. So a few days later, we were given permission to do it again, threw the switch, and damned if the lights didn't go out all over the Pacific Northwest once again. All right. Now, the point is, the hypothesis that the first person devised as a way to explain what happened made perfect sense given the limitations of his knowledge. It's just that he didn't know, and he didn't know what he didn't know, and most of the time, most of us are in that condition. We don't know, and we don't know what we don't know. The point of all that is to say that if what you are doing is concerned with securing the network, it is critical for you as an individual and a responsible being and a citizen of the world to have some sense of what is the ultimate purpose of the network which you are securing. Where does the information originate? Where does it go? How does it get there? It's not about secure tunneling, as you know. Cryptography is the opiate of the naive, someone said. So that you can keep something secure from here to there, but where does it arrive, and what is the use to which it is put? And what is it that you need to know to understand the use to which it is put if you are to expand the narrow focus of network security to understand the larger network of which it is a part? So the game gets very, very tricky. An example would be the tunnel that was built during the Cold War in Berlin into the Soviet sector in order to intercept Soviet military communications. If you're familiar with this story, it was an ingenious act of espionage. Build the tunnel quietly, get to the cables, splice the cables, listen in to the military conversation. Now, what becomes tricky at that point is, do they know you are listening in? It seems as if you have connected to the cables and are intersecting the traffic, but do they know that you are intercepting the traffic? And if they do, are they falsifying the traffic, knowing that you know what they are saying on the traffic? And as it turned out, there was a mole in the U.S. sector that had betrayed the project from its beginning. So in fact, the project was allowed to go forward by the Soviets in order to let it complete itself without jeopardizing the position of the mole and without letting the Americans know that they knew, because they knew that they knew. They didn't know if they knew that they knew that they knew, but they knew that they knew. And so the project took place. The Americans subsequently came to the conclusion that because of the existence of the mole who was subsequently exposed, the entire project had been undermined and the traffic was compromised by the insertion of various false communications in order to deceive the Americans. But in fact, what had happened is, yes, it was compromised because the KGB knew about it, but the KGB did not tell the Army and military intelligence, because if they began to falsify the traffic, it would signal to the Americans that it was falsified, and they would then know that they had a mole, and it was more important to protect the mole. So in fact, the traffic was not falsified because they never told the military that the cable was being intercepted. So the Americans assumed that they knew, but in fact they knew, but they didn't tell the people who knew, who had to know, that they could falsify the traffic, and that's how tricky it gets. That's why it's easier to just focus on whether or not you've got a man-in-the-middle attack or a buffer overflow or something technical. But in fact, the meaning of what it is you are doing is determined by the relationship between the human network that uses it and the computer network. Langdon Winner put it this way: to invent a new technology, he said, requires that society also invent the kinds of people who will use it. All of our older practices, relationships, and ways of defining people's identities fall by the wayside. And new practices, new relationships, new identities take root. The move to computerize and digitize has meant that many pre-existing cultural forms have suddenly gone liquid, turned from solid to liquid, losing their former shape as they are retailored for computerized expression. As new patterns solidify, both useful artifacts and the texture of human relations that surround them are much different than what existed previously. This is a way to say that the fact of the network itself is fundamentally transforming and revolutionary, and the dot-com bust has nothing to do with the fact that that revolution is going forward and continue to redefine who we are. And that is why the identity of the people using the network is critical. I spoke of clouds of power because we don't know what names to give non-state entities that have emerged transnationally, the way the European Union has emerged. When I lived in England in the 1970s, it was a very big deal whether England should join the EU, because their greatest fear was that lorries from the continent would come rumbling through the villages of Shropshire and shake the beautiful, precious Cotswolds buildings to the ground. They thought that all those lorries would destroy fundamentally English society by literally vibrating it apart. They were debating whether to go to the new money, which meant pounds and shillings, as opposed to pounds and shillings and pence. In other words, the evolution of the identity in that case from English to European, an identity change which obviously is still not yet complete because the debate over the euro and its use in Spain and England continues to this very moment. Nevertheless, it was already underway and beginning to cause those kind of seismic shifts through a society or culture that Winner is talking about. That is the nature of the problem when you confront security. Who is secure? You assume you know for whom you work. But who are they? And how are they bounded? Because the boundaries around identities determine organizational, national, and even individual identities. And that is exactly what Winner says is being fundamentally transformed, is going down. And new identities are emerging, and therefore it would behoove you or serve you to know as much as you can know about for whom it is that you work. At Los Alamos, one of the other speakers was the former head of counterintelligence for the KGB. He was telling people how they would be targeted. He gave them some clues. We will become your friends. We will ingratiate ourselves into your lives. We will be patient. We will painstakingly build friendly relationships with each and every one of you. Every one of you. Because even if you think you are insignificant, you are not. Because you may know someone who knows something, who knows something, who knows something. And therefore, at the right time, we will ripen you when you are vulnerable or in need, and your friend can exploit and take advantage of the relationship which over years we have built. And then you suddenly stop and look at the person next to you and think, who exactly are you and where do you work? Now, I can call him an ex-KGB, but that's not an identity. To say someone was formerly KGB, formerly Soviet, formerly Yugoslavia, as opposed to Montenegro, or what other name people are searching to use to have an identity, is not an identity. That's what's gone liquid. That's what's in flux. So that's why the biggest problem for security was put this way by a friend of mine at the National Security Agency. He said, he's been there 17 years, he knows the territory, he said it's not about the technology. It is about this question. How do you live vibrantly? How do you free your mind to completely entertain new possibilities for being and acting? How do you live, he concluded over coffee, it was a Greek coffee. How do you live in a world without walls? And that is the challenge that faces you. That's what the technical track is about. It is building the simulated matrix-like walls in which people believe they can live securely in order to have a feeling of security adequate to be able to function. The machine is the master. And Marshall McLuhan said long ago, the machine easily masters the grim and the dumb. The masters of technology must be lighthearted and intelligent. You bring the intelligence to the task. The question is can you bring also the light heart of imagination to understanding that the world in which we are talking about moving is totally different than the one we knew. Security is not that big a deal. Everybody knows what security is about. Marcus Raynham, a friend of mine, network flight recorder, said it this way. I can't quote him exactly, but I'll quote it. Everything but one. We don't like obscenities here, right? So you can't use obscenities. I'll just bleep it. Marcus said, people know what they should do about security, but they won't do it. So what the bleep? And that was the end of his commentary after 20 years in the business. In other words, people do know what they're supposed to be doing, but the customers, the end user, are endlessly inventive in new uses that they find, unconventional ways of using technologies for things which no human being could have anticipated. Another way to put it, by Rich Cook, was this same idea: programming is a race between software engineers trying to build bigger and bigger idiot-proof programs, and the universe trying to produce bigger and bigger idiots. So far, he said, the universe is winning. Right. So everybody knows what to do. Everybody knows kind of how to do it if they think about it. But if they think about it is the key piece. There is no inevitability, Marshall McLuhan noticed also, so long as we are willing to contemplate what is happening. And therefore, the ability to observe and be perceptive about what it is you're doing. We're talking about the content, folding back into the context and noticing the invisible part, the part you don't always see about the security task, because that's what gives you power to leverage being masters of the universe. Everybody knows about information, but those that know how to use it are the masters of the universe in an information society, and security is the nuts and bolts of that universe. So you have to see the frame. You have to see what artists call the negative space as well as the positive space. If you ever go into a drawing class, you're taught about positive space. Positive space is if you're drawing this cell phone or bouquet of flowers or whatever it is, you have a frame around it. And this defines the positive space. But then you flip to a negative image, and you see that the negative space, that is everything that is not the positive space, is much bigger than the positive space, and in fact is not merely something that surrounds it, it is a shape or a mass in and of itself. It too has substance and value, and then there is a frame around the whole. What I'm talking about is the necessity of seeing the negative space of security, which is the context in which you do it, in order to move from the positive space of what it is that you think you are doing to the bigger picture that defines it, the societal context that gives it meaning, in order to ask yourself the bigger and critical questions about what you are doing. Because it is the human use of what you are doing that's ultimately important. Another friend put it this way. Her daughter, she has a friend who's an engineer, whose daughter came to him and said, I want you to build me a tree house. And he said, great, because he loved to build things for his child. So he began the project of building the tree house. And he looked at how big she was and how many friends she had, and they looked at the tree, and they worked out the plans for it, and they built the tree house, and it was a big, beautiful tree house, and there was a little ladder of steps up the trunk of the tree to it, and she and her friends went up there once, and they came down, and they never went back. So he had to ask himself, what did I do wrong? What did I miss here? And he asked her, what's wrong with the tree house? It was a beautiful, beautiful engineered piece of work. And she said, well, it's fine, but we can't get our toys up there. In other words, he never asked a critical question, which was, what is the purpose for which the treehouse exists? What kind of space does it create? It creates a space in which she and her friends wanted to move up their terrestrial toys and play with them up there. Well, you can define the network the same way. It's a space into which people want to move their terrestrial symbols and meanings and behaviors and actions and military and economic and intelligence strategies, and they want to be able to move it into the place that is the network space. And unless the question is asked at the first, what is the purpose for which we are designing this thing? Because security begins with the design and is not an add-on, then we will never be able to get at the context of the task. So I'm going to be repeating in different ways what I'm trying to get at. Matt Blaze put it this way at a Computers, Freedom, and Privacy conference a number of years ago in Texas. He said, anything that is in the critical security path is potentially the weakest link in the system, including the definition of the problem. The definition of the problem as seen by the implementers and the real definition of the problem are seldom the same thing. So you will have people for whom you work, to whom you report, or who hire you as consultants. Your clients will say, this is what we need to do. And the question is always, is that really what they need to do? What is the ultimate purpose for which they are building the space? Who is going to use it, and why? And what is essential to the feeling of security and then the actual fact of security in that space? You know how people make these decisions. In Israel, a brilliant young woman named Sal Tzvi is the security architect for Microsoft Israel. And she likes to psychoanalyze the system. She has noticed that more and more in Israel, people are putting a security black box into the system. And that gives people a greater feeling of security to have the system plug into a black box and then the black box plug out into the world. And now they feel more secure because there is this black box achieving security for them. She has therefore decided that their value of security is in proportion to what you don't know about it. Because to the degree that it is hidden in the black box and you don't know what's in there, to that degree you feel better about it and will buy it more readily. But to the degree that the code or the hardware in the box is exposed for all to see in order to determine its flaws, what it does and what it doesn't do, at that point it loses value because it becomes simply one more engineering task to achieve more or less. And therefore the value is proportionate to what people don't know about it. She said it is obvious that people will buy things that alleviate their anxiety. People are anxious about security. And if they can alleviate their anxiety by a purchase, then they will rationalize the purchase as worthwhile and useful and glad to do it, especially if it is unknown in its engineering, its design, and its consequences. So already you are up against a huge monumental task, which is the people you serve, your masters, your lords, are in fact working at cross purposes to what you are in fact doing, which is attempting to build a secure network and to secure it. All right? That's why it's important to understand how the context determines the content of the questions people will ask. Let me go back to NSA. A friend put it this way. I will refer to him always as a senior Department of Defense official. That is my instruction. That means that we make it sound more important than it is by saying, oh, I can't tell you who it is. Well, I can't tell you who it is because he works there and that's just the rule. So it's not that big a deal. But he does have some insight over his many years with the agency as to how things have evolved. The computer science people and the security people came out of different schools. The computer science people were concerned with a very different definition of elegance and beauty. They wanted to build a model of something that was beautiful, that was elegant, that was efficient, that was clean, that was lean, that was a work of art. At least the best of them did. And that's what they worked on. And they worked on doing that in order to build a system that more or less worked. You know that they weren't concerned with security. Security means separation. The separation of function, the separation of people, the separation by distinctions of all the component parts and modules. They were concerned with building something integrated, unified, and beautiful. And they were interested in building it in an environment in which a malicious threat was not present. In other words, that for which they built it was breakdown. They did not want the system to break down. Therefore, it was designed to be engineered not to break down, not to withstand malicious attack. They weren't interested in a malicious attacker. They were interested in whether the machine itself would work. On the crypto side of the house, on the other hand, you had two different kinds of minds. And one of the advantages NSA has, and the other agencies for which you and your friends and your comrades work, is that you have the best and the brightest. So many minds massively parallel attacking a single task. And this is why it is so difficult for the hacker world to genuinely compete with them. Because they anticipate, they have been there. Whit Diffie was genuinely shocked when he found out that that long odyssey in pursuit of public key cryptography that he and Marty Hellman finally created as the Diffie-Hellman key, Diffie-Hellman key, had been invented 10 years earlier in England inside the intelligence community. Conversations Phil Zimmerman had about PGP with people who visited his presentation when he first unveiled this powerful new application made very clear that it had been known, anticipated, built, and discarded because the purposes inside were not the same as Phil Zimmerman's purposes outside. It wasn't a new concept. These people are not fools, despite the way some of them sometimes look. They are really very, very smart people, massively dedicated to single tasks. And some of them are attackers, and some of them are defenders. And on the crypto side, those who are defenders looked at how can we build it, and those who are attackers looked at how can we take it apart. One has a synthetic imagination, the other has the mentality, as a friend of mine puts it, of a wolf. All a wolf needs to do is circle the campfire and look for one little unsuspecting piece of to pluck. And it doesn't matter if all the rest of you are not bitten, as long as it gets in and gets a piece of his belly. You have to think like attackers think. You have to think like a wolf. You have to think like hackers think. You have to be, in fact, a hacker. You have to be like Bruce Schneier, the cryptographer, who tells me that he cannot walk through a store without looking at the security and thinking of how he can break it. In other words, if you do not have the mind of a criminal, then you cannot work in this business. You need to have the mind of a criminal in order to have the mind of a cop. An old movie, Undercover Cop, the man stared in the mirror and he said, I sometimes wonder if I'm a cop pretending to be a criminal or a criminal pretending to be a cop. The distinction is very, very unclear, as murky as the identities that we have. And therefore, every good hacker knows, hacker in the correct sense of the term, that it is not your behavior that is a problem. It is not what you do in breaking systems and penetrating them and understanding them that is a problem. It is your perceived allegiance. The only question that is asked of hackers is, who do you serve? And that is why years ago I could say to the young men and women of DEF CON, if you want the tools and you want the toys and you want the techniques that are the best in the world, then come work for the people who not only have them, but also will provide cover for your activities so that you get to hack your little hearts out. If you're good, and do it to your heart's content. You need this kind of mind. Weld said this. You learn by doing, breaking into systems. You build the tools. You experiment. You can't read about it. You have to read code and write code. All the best hackers read and write code, even if they code badly, that is inefficiently, unmaintainably, difficult to understand, but it always works. You have to know how to reverse engineer a piece of software. What do the bytes on the wires mean if I play with them, if I tweak them, if I change this or that? What happens? You end up knowing the software better than the designers because you know what it can do and not what it was designed to do. Most quote-unquote security professionals, he concluded, have never done this. If you believe the design, you are believing that the emperor has no clothes. So what did my friends say they had to learn at NSA? Those people who built these beautiful, elegant, aesthetically whole systems. They had to change their definition when they realized what a malicious attack could do. The malicious attack could take down everything that they had built. They discovered humility because they discovered that the system is insecure inherently. By virtue of its nature and its complexity, no system is or can be perfectly secure. They discovered the real potency of asymmetric warfare, which is, like the wolf, to find merely a single flaw through which you can penetrate. What does it matter if Saudi Arabia is secured by a perimeter if there's a couple of guards with rifles that can't stop 3 or 4 or 6 or 7 trucks loaded with explosives coming into the compound? All you need to do is find the one weak space through which to move your tiny army in order to create havoc. So, they changed their motivation, and that is really the point of this whole talk. Your motivation in doing security is what is critical, because what they discovered was that actionable intelligence saves lives. Beautiful mathematics, beautiful code, beautiful engineering does not. In other words, many of the people I have known in security have moved into it because they love doing it. They love the code. They love the technology. They love playing in that space. But sooner or later, that light bulb begins to glow dimly and then brightly that says, and for what purpose are you doing this? Actionable intelligence, that is, the meaning of what you are doing, moving out into the larger network and knowing who you serve and what they're going to do with what you're doing. That saves lives. That becomes critical. So, what is the context that is evolving? I check the time. What is the context that is evolving? What they did is redefine what they meant by beautiful. They had to design the technology to be lean and clean, but with alarm checks and with more parts, so that while each part might break more, each break would mean less in terms of security. In other words, they had to be concerned with the 5 or 10% of the cost that was added to it. It was based on knowing the device would fail, and that under attack, a simple failure could lead to catastrophic, cascading consequences. And my friend says, and I quote, "It made us humble, seeing how absolutely fragile security is in the face of malicious attack." That principle of asymmetric warfare, that the bad guy will always aim at the most fragile point, turned out to be true. The fragility of what they realized they were doing, leading to humility, resulted in a revised definition of what was elegant and beautiful. The new definition became, how few parts can I integrate into this device so that it will fail in the safest possible way? That is a different task that came out of a different context. Now, when you're working as an engineer, you may think the coldness of the machinery is kind of redemptive because it protects you from knowing who our partners really are. But this fellow at NSA talked about a friend he had at CIA, and he said, now he works very differently. He works in human intelligence, and his goal is to so compromise a human being that he owns them. Now hackers love to talk about owning you. I own you. I own your box. I own your system. Well, that's a way of transporting into the security space what this CIA friend of my buddy's says he does when he tries to recruit someone. He said, I never put pressure on the person themselves. I never want my fingerprints over the operation. I never want the person to know that I have been recruiting them. So I will never go at Gurdeep directly. What I will do is go at his wife, or his mother, or his father. I will go at his children. I will go to his work. And in each one of those places, I will put the pressure on him that makes his life unsustainable in its current form. I will squeeze him through the misery of his children, the misery of his workplace, and the misery of his family, until so desperate and squeezed almost until he has no life left in him, Gurdeep will pop into my arms and come to me and say, what can I do for you? And I will become his friend. Thank you, Gurdeep, for participating in that little act. That's the way it is. Those are your partners. That's the world. No one has the high moral ground. And the difference between someone doing that and someone hacking into a system, well, no one has the high moral ground. So, what kind of person does security? The context begins with the kind of person you are, and that knowing who you are, knowing yourself, we're going to get what we call in America touchy-feely for a minute. Knowing your predispositions, knowing your soul, knowing how you operate, knowing your psyche, knowing how you think, knowing how you feel, knowing how you construct reality is critical, because that's the piece that we usually don't see. A friend of mine who worked as a profiler for CIA said, I learned as a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, that I loved the dark side. I'm a little girl, little pinafore, little curls. I loved coming out of the Port Authority in New York and seeing the hookers and the pimps and the con men on the streets. I loved it so much that when she finally did her thesis for a master's degree, she did it by going and living with crack whores in New York, so she could observe them, the classic sociologist, psychologist, priest type, who inserts themselves into an environment with the cover of their identity to protect them from touching too deeply that which they want to observe and understand completely, because in their hearts they know that it is them. I loved the dark side, she said. I realized that I was a very, very odd duck, she said. I wanted to know how things really worked. I had a roommate in college who investigated the Holocaust and the impact it had on people, and how, above all, anybody could survive the worst of it. And I realized, she said, that I did it because that knowledge of survival spoke to the hole in my soul. That's pretty good for a CIA profiler, don't you think, as self-awareness goes? And this woman is no slouch. A few months ago, a gentleman from Pakistan was executed for having shot several CIA people in front of the CIA office building in Washington. When he did it, he got out of the country, and this woman worked with the FBI. She didn't do it alone, but she had a huge part of it, huge enough so that she has a plaque on the wall of her office, which has now been declassified so that it can be on the wall of her office. Usually what people inside those kind of organizations do is go in, the director of intelligence says, good job, gives you a plaque, you say thank you, he takes the plaque back and burns it. And the plaque ceases to exist and the mission ceases to exist. Well, her mission was to profile the guy, identify him, and ultimately, in Karachi, nail him and bring him back in cuffs, which they did. And they executed him. So she talked about what it's like to be inserted as a tall, statuesque, a very attractive American woman onto the ground in Karachi in a way that you don't stand out, right? So all of the ways she did the act of a particular kind of American woman on the ground in Karachi, because she couldn't hide who she was, but she could make it look like it was something else, all in order to achieve the goal of her mission. She manifested what Edward Wilson said in his book, Consilience is true of all great scientists. I think it's true of all great hackers, and certainly great security people. All of them have passion, obsessiveness, and daring. You must use your imagination to entertain the most outrageous possibilities and then play with them in that security space, because if you don't, someone else will. Somebody is going to be doing it. You have to see a willingness, an ability to create your life literally from nothing. You have to have a persona that you use and manage, and you cannot be so fused with it that you don't know the distinction between who you are and who it is. One of the revolutions that the computer revolution has caused is in education. Many of you are too young to know that you're on this side of 1917 and that the Tsar's army has already been in retreat and has left. You have been socialized to a new way of education. But I observed my own son, who's now about 33, doing this. When he went to university in America, he didn't find what he wanted. So he went to different departments, 5 of them, and he took pieces of each one, and he created a major called Symbolic Systems Studies. And he went to AI, and he went to computer science, he went to math, he went to cognitive psychology, he went to philosophy, epistemology, and he took different courses and he put them together. When he got up and graduated, they said everybody else graduated in physics or chemistry or English or whatever, and then they said, and we have one ad hoc major. And everybody laughed, because that's what they do when you're brilliant and on the edge and ahead of the curve. They laugh. I knew his ad hoc major was the wave of the future. What he had demonstrated was the inability of the structures of knowledge from the past to hold what was necessary in the future, and therefore he had the ingenious creativity to take pieces and create a whole new thing out of the pieces of the past and create something for the future, which now had a name. The people who are brilliant, creative, original, are the ones who see first what's coming and give it a name. Nietzsche said that creativity is merely leaning a little forward into the future as things emerge over the edge, so that before everyone else sees them, you see them just a few seconds, and you give it a name, and then people think you invented it, and you create it out of whole cloth, and then they believe you, and they walk in that space. That's what the computer revolution has given you, the tools and the power to do, because security is the engine of it. Why? Because what is in the security space is the mind of society, as I said at the beginning. The mind of all of society is what needs to be secure, and it is secured above all by the management of perception and conception at the top level, the manipulation of symbols and meanings, so that people like digital sheep can be led in a cage where you will. Get them fused, get them into communities, get them believing in their new identity. Then you have a cage, then move the cage, and the bird will follow. That's ultimately what's happening in that space. So you have to know who you are, and you have to know who you are in relationship to the task, so that you can use yourself as a tool, as part of the security project. This is Zen-like. This is seeing the obvious. Security is about seeing the obvious, stepping back and seeing the obvious. Sun Tzu said that all warfare is deception. What did Sun Tzu mean? He meant that when there is a flow, when there is a flow, the Tao, and it is flowing, no one notices it. But when there is a disturbance in the force, a perturbation or eddy in the Tao, people notice it. That is an anomaly in the pattern. That is deception. All warfare is based on deception and its management and manipulation. Security is about seeing the obvious before anyone else sees it. Fred Cohn, you know the name Fred Cohn? He described viruses in the 1970s, long before anybody else even knew the name of a quote-unquote virus. And when he gave his presentation based on the papers he had written, the response he got was, "But that's obvious." And he said, just last week, but it wasn't obvious to anybody before I described it. Now it is obvious because I gave it a name and described the dynamics according to which it operates, and then people get a hold of it. Those who name the new realities and describe them are the geniuses and creative minds of this discipline, as of every other. So, you have to compensate for the bias of perception through the scientific method. Fred said that. Everybody I've talked to said that. One who was a model for one of the hackers in the movie Sneakers, he said, I read 2 books. He's in his 60s now, late 60s. 2 books influenced my work in security. One was the scientific method. How it really works as a way to make sure I work to fail. I work to fail again and again because my ego wants me not to fail. My ego wants to succeed. My ego wants me to be right. But the scientific method says I must constantly skeptically attack my own rightness in order to determine what is true. The other book he read was How Not to Lose a Bridge. How Not to Lose a Bridge. Why? Because it taught him about negative thinking. It taught him what that profiler from CIA told me about the inability of most profilers to step back from the data, forensics, and allow the data to tell you what is in fact happening. It is to leap to conclusions too quickly, the patterning of the mind to see things which it thinks it knows, but doesn't know. Profilers think they know. During the Washington snipers, when a couple of snipers were taking people off at bus stops and in front of stores, all these talking heads showed up on cable television. The one thing you knew about a talking head that is an expert on cable television, if they know, they don't speak. If they speak, they don't know. Anyone who knew what was going on could not be there because it was classified information. Therefore, anyone speaking about it couldn't know what was going on. Therefore, the value of their insight was worthless. But the profilers said it was clear that it was a certain kind of white male and so on, same as they did with the Unabomber. They missed it because they leaped to conclusions instead of letting the data present itself to them. If you can learn how to step back, you can't query the system about its assumptions. That's the problem with computer security. You cannot ask the system what assumptions it's making about security because it doesn't know. That's what Matt Blaze meant. By the definition of the problem is often the problem. You have to step back from the system and look at the edges at the negative space to see how it defines itself. Because if you don't look at it from the point of view of the attacker or the tool that you're using, you won't be able to see it. Marcus Raynham told me he learned everything he needs to know about security from trying to train his horse. Why? Because, other than his horse is huge and unmanageable, his horse, when you go into horse training, he said you try to dominate the horse and control it. But he learned that he had to just step back and watch the horse and learn how to think like a horse thinks. Because a horse is a huge, intelligent animal that will tell you everything it needs to know. It's the same with security, same with hacking. Just step back and watch and observe the system, or let the data speak to you about what has happened, and it will tell you. And be very, very careful not to prematurely get sucked in, as all human beings do, to imposing a pattern on the data. A friend told me this story. I just love to talk. I just love to talk. And I would love to keep talking, but I'm going to bring this to a close. A friend told me the story of a guy who designed a torpedo. It was elegantly designed. They designed this thing to follow the magnetic field of the object of its attack. And they were testing it. And there were people out in the helicopter floating over the submarine, and they let the torpedo go from the submarine, and it zoomed through the water, and it aimed for the helicopter, which was hovering above the waves, just as it was supposed to. But they hadn't programmed the torpedo to know when to stop. All they programmed it to do was find object, home in, get object. And so the torpedo literally not only could watch the wake, you can imagine the sensation. You're crouched in an open door helicopter, and this little torpedo just straight out of the water, through the open door of the helicopter, and it lands in your lap. Because they had not bothered to look at it from the point of view of the torpedo. They had not asked the torpedo what its assumptions were about what it was supposed to do and how it was going to do it. So Fred Cohn puts it this way. He said, people don't see the problem, they see themselves. And that's why I so encourage you to learn how to step back from yourself individually and how you have been trained to look and see and perceive, but also the collective culture around you and how it has surrounded you with negative space that determines how you define the problem. There is no room in this work if you take it seriously. Actionable intelligence is about saving lives. It's about saving society ultimately. And there is no room for ego. And the way I heard it said lately, do you know who Cybertron is? Does that name mean anything to anybody? Anybody? Cybertron 93, 94 out of Detroit, kid from the hood, put together the best cell phone cloning operation America had ever seen. Cybertron had a genius that only a streetwise kid could have. He was also a ruthless, hardcore criminal, bless his heart, who also used his intelligence to amass a huge amount of money, and he managed to get through that relatively unscathed, just a short-term prison sentence in which he told me he turned lemons into lemonade. He learned from the good fellas, the mafia, the truth of Sun Tzu. He had studied Sun Tzu. He had studied military manuals. Growing up in the hood, what else do you study? And the most important thing you know is how to build a crew, how to manage your enemies, how to manage your friends. Cybertron was a pretty smart dude, and he said the one thing he couldn't abide was ego. When the crew was together, each person had a specialization, a thing that they had to do. This was analog cloning in the good old days when it was easy. And he could clone a new phone, sell it for $500 in 20 minutes. And each person knew their task and knew what they were supposed to do. And if you didn't say, I don't know, he said, that's the only time I beat you up. And he didn't mean, in management, Vodafone, they say we're going to beat you up. They mean figuratively. Cybertron meant it literally. The only time we were going to break your legs, and he meant break your legs, is if I say, does everybody know what they're supposed to do? And if you didn't know and didn't speak up, then I'm going to punish you. There's no room for your ego keeping you from speaking in such a moment, he said. Ego is the enemy of effectiveness. Well, when somebody as good as Cybertron speaks, I listen. Ego is the enemy. It's what social engineering and hacking is all about. If you can manage your ego, you can manage anything because you're willing to blend back and not need the notoriety or attention or self-definition that comes from others that tells you how good or important or effective you are. It comes from within, and then you can define your history and your life and your persona for yourself. Intelligence is only of value if it is acted upon. I have a great story about that, but I'm not going to tell you. Save it for coffee. Can you quickly, amazing how quickly I went through that? Okay. Conclusion. What we're really trying to do is get a self-chat dialogue going in your head between what you do and seeing what you do so that you step back and see it more clearly. It's the way Fred Cohn defined it was in terms of negotiation, like with the Palestinians and the Israelis. This is the problem with the media. The media presents everything up front in a primary way as if what is happening is what is happening. And what he would love to see is all political commentary becoming play-by-play, like for a soccer match, a football match, so that the commentators are telling you what is really happening. So when Ariel Sharon says, we're never going to abandon all of our settlements in the West Bank, the commentator would say, okay, Sharon is doing this kind of negotiating ploy. What he really means is this. And we should have that kind of commentary about all of the political negotiation that is going on so that we can step back from a condition of primary naivete to secondary naivete and see more clearly what it is that we are in fact doing at a deeper level, and that makes the work of security more powerful, gives you the leverage you need, gives you the tools in your hands to be masters of the universe. You thought you were just going into computer work. You thought you were just sliding into security. That's not what it's about. By nature of the revolution to which I have alluded but not really described, you are in fact in leadership positions in the world, defining the space in which others operate. You are in fact building the definition of the matrix by building the imaginary walls within which people believe they are living. Therefore, to know what you are doing with a high consciousness, a clear intentionality, and an absolutely obsessive, rigorous, passionate focus is the essential imperative of your life. You are forced of necessity to play the game at that higher level of understanding that has defined this presentation. Niccolo Machiavelli, on the cusp of another revolution like this because it was engineered by the printing press in the Renaissance, said this: it ought to be remembered there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, nothing more perilous to conduct, nothing more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. You may not have asked for that leadership, but that's what's been given to you. All I'm asking is that you do this conference and your lives with as much clarity, as much focus, and as much intentionality as humanly possible, because that's how you become true masters of the universe, leveraging the power of symbols by defining the structures through which they move, all unthinkingly, into the lives of people, from individuals all the way up to the trans-global, transplanetary space that we are building in the 21st century. Okay? Thank you very, very much. Okay. I don't think we have a lot of time for Q&A, but I'm around for 2 days, and I've got cards out on the table. There's an email address. If the fiber optic cut in Boston has been repaired, I will again have email on the website, and it's on there. And anybody wants to talk about any of this or any implications of this anytime, just email or call, and I'll be glad to be in dialogue with you about it. Thank you. The wireless network is up, so hack your little hearts out.